So welcome everyone. Today I want to talk about intention transfer and a bunch of changes and theories and nonverbal communication and chakras and partitions and the course of civilization.
But what else, Jeff?
That's all. No, I'm sure I'll cover some other things. But I'm going to go through a number of these things fairly quickly. I would also like it to be that people ask questions. So as far as the introduction, in a bunch of conversations, I've sort of, pointed out what everybody, something that I think hopefully is common knowledge by now, which is that there have been a lot of changes in the group over the last 4 months. In particular, we added bodywork, energy healing, like chakra models came online as being sort of very commonly used. Vibreeds, which we were doing from before, theories of intention transfer, people start talking about magic mind reading, talismans, etc. Okay, that's what's happening. With a very large amount of content, you have theories, you have different practices, you have different reported effects of various types, different phenomena. It would be really nice to figure out how to unify all of, so what's really been figured out? So it'd be nice to unify all of this inside of a theoretical framework. I found recently, and then sort of posted a summary of this in the Jeff Updates channel, that there's I now have alighted upon a particular way of looking at these things. I want to describe the specific claim, the big spectrum of views that one can hold. I'm hoping that this is going to sort of give us a bunch of frameworks that allow us to discuss relevant questions. And then I'm going to talk about sort of how all of this stuff affects us. So the key claim, which I'm going to then put in the context of a wide range of views, is that nonverbal communication is at least as precise, expressive, and central as verbal communication. I'm going to give a more specific version of this, but sort of starting off, I think a lot of people will think that they understand what I mean and think that after all this is just common sense. There have been a couple of comments sort of to this effect. The thing that I'm proposing is not commonsensical and is in fact quite sort of extreme of a claim, and then there's going to be a whole bunch of different variations and so forth. In all of this I'm going to be talking about verbal communication, but by verbal also includes, that's not just spoken or written, but also pictures. So if we have some people, and then the people fall in love, and then you can use diagrams and whatnot. Call all of that stuff verbal communication. Okay, so I want to describe a whole bunch of questions. I said this is sort of labeled spectrum of views. Actually, it should be spectra. Yeah.
This might not be a useful question. Where would you place something like environmental communication in a third category? Like the aesthetics of space and like.
I'm gonna say that it's something like I would count that under nonverbal communication, though it's like a side case that I'm not going to be really talking about. You could think of that as the nonverbal communication of whoever put the thing together. And so someone designed the space, and so there's something being communicated, but I'm largely not talking about that right now. I'm largely going to be talking about what an individual person is communicating. And they might be communicating something using various objects. So like if you wear a gun on your hip, for instance, you are communicating something non-verbally. And what you're communicating may depend a lot on your facial expression. It could be, or your demeanor. It could be that what you're communicating is that the people around you are safe and protected by you. Because if anyone shows up and shit goes down, you're armed and you know how to use this weapon. On the other hand, you could be communicating that you are a dangerous entity, and if things get crazy, maybe you'll just pull out the gun and start firing on people. All of these things could be communicated by your demeanor if you're wearing a gun on your hip. Okay, so first question is there nonverbal communication? Does it occur? We're going to, starting very basic, you might divide the world into two camps, those who say yes and those who, it'd be really interesting if there are people who actually, upon thinking about it, denied that there was nonverbal communication. I think in practice, when people talk about talk about communication, they frequently, like in practice, limit themselves to just speaking of verbal communication. So we could distinguish the views: is there such a thing as nonverbal communication? And actually, because essentially any view that can be stated that's simple someone has held, you'll find people holding that view. So probably somebody somewhere thinks there's no nonverbal communication. The sort of standard view here is that yes, of course, there's nonverbal communication. The next question I want to look at is, I don't need to spend much time on that one. The next thing I want to look at is nonverbal communication always scaffolded on verbal communication? So a person, you might say, how was the presentation? And the person's like, oh, it was interesting, right? Or they might say, oh, it was interesting. Or, if we just have the word interesting, so they say, it was interesting. You can get all sorts of different things depending on just inflection. And so, but there what you have is a scaffold. You have the verbal aspect of the communication, and then you have the other things that center around it. Yeah?
Is it possible that instead of nonverbal, you're meaning something like non-propositional? Because the inflection is, in a sense, verbal, and it is, in a sense, not the same thing as the words?
Yeah, so I don't have the terminology worked out yet, but yes, something like that. The inflection can be verbal, not in a sense. It's spoken, but it's not itself isn't the word, like the class of word. The word is interesting. When you look it up in the dictionary, you don't have interesting and interesting and interesting as different entries in the dictionary. So the question here, but you can see that with inflection is scaffolded on the actual words. With no words, there's no inflection. You might imagine a sort of view, you might imagine thinking that all nonverbal communication is in fact scaffolded on verbal. Yeah?
There are inflected speeches where you can understand what must be being said from the inflection without understanding any of the words. When people imitate animals and so on.
Sure.
It's very easy to do inflection without words.
Sure. I think that's the case. Yep. When you lay out views like this, the point is to sort of make it clear what the total logical space is. And so a person might say, well, of course, it's clearly the case that not all nonverbal communication is scaffolded on verbal communication, because you could have it be that you convey a whole lot simply by raising an eyebrow. And then someone's like, what did you think of the proposal? And the person's like, like this. And they don't even say, they just raise an eyebrow. It's like, I need more time to work on the proposal. I'll get back to you later. And the person's like, which communicates a lot. Like, yeah, I hear what you're saying, and okay, I guess it's fine for you to work on your proposal, but I guess I'm not really that optimistic about this for you. So it looks like, so you can distinguish the views. You could imagine someone thinking that all nonverbal communication is scaffolded on verbal communication. I think that's not the case. I think that you can have nonverbal communication which is separate. So then we get to questions that are going to be a bit more difficult. Question here is, how expressive is nonverbal communication? And so you might imagine a view according to which it's narrowly expressive. where there are some things that you can say, so to speak, non-verbally, like, hey, or, oh, hi, or that looks yummy, or shall we get out of here? So various things are happening and you're like, head leans towards the door, expression like this, you're saying, shall we get out of here? You could imagine that there's a very limited vocabulary that could be used. And there were rather only a small number of things that could be expressed. You might imagine, and this is sort of a spectrum, so I'm artificially breaking out sort of midpoints in it, but you could imagine that nonverbal communication is moderately expressive, such that you would be able to say things like, sure, I understand what you're saying, but I still don't think it's going to work. So they say, oh, but I think, and you're like that, and that has indicated that sure, I understand what you're saying, but I still don't think it's going to work. So that's the view on which it's moderately expressive. You could imagine that it is as expressive as words. So perhaps it would be possible to convey non-verbally the claim that justice and the beautiful are inseparable, or that I will have my vengeance in this life or the next, or could you tell my Aunt Susan that I won't be there for dinner, with assuming that they don't know who your Aunt Susan is or that you have an aunt named Susan. You might imagine that if it's as expressive as words, that you might be able to non-verbally say that the launch code is ZX243-219B lowercase j uppercase VF29164, and that you need the blue identification key in order to unlock the control panel so that you can put in the launch codes. That would be a little bit more difficult. So with some of these I'm giving examples where I'm like, I don't really know if that's going to work. How exactly would you use nonverbal communication? I guess there's a way to hack it where you're like, 3, 4. But imagine not like that. Imagine nonverbal communication that actually nails something like giving out the launch codes. Yeah.
This is largely just semantics, but it strikes me that nonverbal is somewhat imprecise, and we need non-symbolic. Where like sign language is...
I thought about calling it non-symbolic also,
yeah.
Except that then there's a question of what counts as a sign. So if you say a thing and I raise my eyebrow, right? So maybe you mean signs where, so something in this area sounds good, maybe it's non-symbolic. It gets tricky for a number of reasons, but yes, something like this might be a better way to think about it. Think about it as though you could say it's explicit and implicit communication. But then there will be disagreements. It seemed pretty explicit. You said, are you interested in funding this project? And it's like, well, I didn't say anything explicitly. Like, he looked displeased and, dropped and so maybe that was a symbolic gesture. So I think I haven't yet gotten the words right here.
Another point of confusion here is that people can have conversations using words without using their mouths. And so it's like you can be experiencing words just like directly says, like, is that verbal? Is that explicit?
And what do you mean by experiencing words?
So it's like as though you're doing articulation, and then it feels like it's on the other person, and then it's going back and forth. It's like, is that explicit?
Wait, so say again what the case is you're thinking of?
Just like not having full conversations without saying them aloud.
Yeah, we're getting there. So there's this further, and so then you could imagine that actually it's more expressive than words, where in addition to being able to give them the launch codes non-verbally, you also say, as soon as I learned that, so non-verbally you managed to say, as soon as I learned that the launch code was VX29B-3, then I felt untranslatable 4, which caused me to express untranslatable 2 to Susan, who was delighted. And so you could imagine that there's a number of sort of things that are able to be expressed without words that can't be expressed with words.
Yeah, but it seems like you have an alternative, which is maybe also what a lot of the culture would do.
Yep.
Which is that it's both more expressive and less precisely
And that
expressive?
gets me to the next thing. So there's something like, what's the relation here, right? So you could have it be, let's see, how do we phrase this? Basically, how do verbal and nonverbal overlap? So you could imagine that you have something like, here's verbal and nonverbal is a subset. You could imagine that here's nonverbal and you have verbal as a subset. You could imagine that you have your Venn diagram shape where you've got verbal and nonverbal, where you can give them the launch codes verbally, but can't verbally express how you truly feel about them. But you can non-verbally express how you truly feel about them, and you can verbally express the launch codes. So you could imagine that as a view, and then there's another view according to which the nonverbal and verbal overlap is it's just the same. And so anything that can be expressed verbally can be expressed non-verbally, and vice versa. So then there are further questions. Another question has to do with so when you're actually communicating, there's a question of how related are the verbal and nonverbal content while you're interacting with someone and communicating with them. And I guess in terms of relation, there's going to be a number of different ways of, let's see, in a particular, so let's say how related are verbal and nonverbal in a particular communication instance. And so you might imagine here that the verbal and nonverbal communicate the same content. The thing, you are saying, I'd love to go to dinner this evening. And that's what comes out in the words, and that's what comes out non-verbally, and they're just the same. You could imagine two different channels that communicate the same thing. You could imagine that the verbal and nonverbal, though, can become desynct in various ways. You might imagine that the nonverbal and the verbal have to be on the sort of same topic, but not necessarily saying the same thing. And so the person says, would you like to go to dinner? You say, I'd love to go to dinner. But the nonverbal indicates that there's a hesitation and perhaps you actually have something else to do, and you're about to give an excuse for why you can't go to dinner. Well, there, it's on the same topic. The words are saying one thing, the nonverbal is saying something else. In this case, they are consistent with each other. They fit into a single communication package. And but nevertheless, there are different things being said. So you can say different things, same topic. So then, maybe we should call that the same specific topic. There's also the possibility that the nonverbal is communicating on the same general topic, but not the same specific topic. And so they say, would you like to go to dinner? And you say, I'd love to go to dinner tonight. And the way you say it indicates your deep distress about humanity and where civilization is going. And what does it matter if we do one thing or another? We could go to dinner or not. All is futile. Well, okay, I mean, in some sense, you are on the same topic. There's a little bit of communication on the same topic, or the same specific topic. But so it could be that there's just this constant communication from you about the futility of everything, and that happens even when you are explicitly saying that, yes, you'd love to go to dinner. It might be happening even when you say, that doesn't sound futile, I think that will actually work. And that's happening verbally, while on the more general topic of will it work in the end, will any of this really amount to anything, you're just constantly communicating that the answer is no. And then you could imagine that the verbal and nonverbal are quite thoroughly unrelated to one another. Now, how thorough? Well, I mean, everything's related to everything else in some regard. Time and electrons and beauty and the number 228 are all related in some regard. So you're not going to get totally unrelated, but you could imagine that you're having a conversation verbally, explicitly about whether you'll go to dinner, and non-verbally, you're having a conversation about the fact that there's a new movie out. That would be like really weird, right? You could imagine that while you're there as a spy, talking to them about your job working in working for the DMV, when in fact non-verbally you're giving them the launch codes and you're telling them to not tell anyone the launch codes, and the other person is receiving non-verbally the launch codes and they're agreeing that they're not going to tell anyone the launch codes, and then verbally the person's like, oh, I guess, yeah, that sounds interesting, yeah, I've been to the DMV before. And so you could imagine there being nonverbal communication that was notably off topic, at least if the official topic is set by what's being said explicitly. Yeah.
Just to check for D.
Yeah.
This is the degree of overlap in terms of what is possibly communicated.
Yeah, that's right. Possibly communicated. So it could be that there's, I'm going to talk a bit about this, but it could be that people are always communicating just the same thing. And so their actual range of nonverbal expressiveness is really narrow, where in principle the expressiveness is very large.
Sure.
And so this is in principle. Okay, so then there's a question as to how much nonverbal communication is there. And so you might imagine that there's only nonverbal communication that's scaffolded on verbal communication. You could imagine that there's only one nonverbal conversation, or you could imagine that while you are there having a single verbal conversation, you're having 6 other simultaneous nonverbal conversations with the person. And so on one level, you're giving them the launch codes. And on another level, you're talking to them about how everything is futile ultimately. And on another level, you're sort of humming to yourself in a particular way. And on another level, something else. So you could imagine that there are multiple simultaneous nonverbal conversations. You might imagine that it doesn't blend into, or doesn't sort of distill into really nicely separated conversations. There's 2 nicely separated nonverbal conversations, and then a sort of melange of things that are being said nonverbally. Lastly, in terms of the different views, there's a question as to how dynamic. You could imagine that nonverbal communication is, so if you use verbal communication as your standard, where you have, you can pay attention to how quickly the words are coming out. You could measure them. You could record it and then count the number of words and divide that by the time and give you a nice objective measure of how fast it's going. You could have people divided into topics. You could look at the number of topics that are covered per minute or per hour, the number of distinct ideas expressed. There'd be a question as to how to quantify those things. But if we use that as the standard, then you could imagine that nonverbal communication is static. There is one thing being communicated, and that is all in any given instance of communication. So in one conversation, there's just one thing being presented nonverbally, or it could be 7 different things, but they never change. You could imagine that it's less dynamic than verbal communications, that verbal communication skips all around, but the nonverbal's pretty steady. You quickly went, through the topics of, whether it was right for Caesar to cross the Rubicon, and some recent thoughts about developments in abstract mathematics. Then you're talking about where you'll go to the movie, but all along the nonverbal communication is that you like and accept the other person. and they like and accept you, and that's pretty much all that's being said on the nonverbal level. That would be that, so you could imagine that, you could imagine and you could imagine your liking and expression of that growing over the course of the conversation. So there's some degree of change. You could imagine that it's equally dynamic, and you could imagine that it is more dynamic. It could be that it just takes so long to say entire sentences out loud. And in the space of a second, you've already changed the topic 3 times non-verbally, and we'll probably change it 5 more times by the end of the sentence. Okay. So this is a range of views. So anybody questions about the views? One thing that's notable in distinguishing views like this is that sometimes you'll have a very strong reaction, like, well, it's clearly this one. And then these other ones are clearly wrong. That's great. If in fact the things are clear, distinguishing them helps to render the things even more clear. In some cases, you'll find that you initially think, well, obviously it's option D2, and then, well, upon further reflection, maybe it's option D3, and so rendering the things explicit can be useful for that reason as well. Yeah?
One thing I'm going to be curious about later that I think is not up here is on the question of how much overlap there is. There's a world where the verbal stuff is entirely represented, or is entirely communicable by the body layer, but by a fairly small bottleneck. So like, you mentioned body layer can communicate in binary, and you can sit there and then all verbal communication is possible via the body layer because you're channeling it through a more simple.
Yeah, I mean, well, so there it's. I'm gonna think a little bit about how I want to parse that. Yeah, no.
What do you classify the Austin-like conception of linguistic actions as nonverbal or a further category that sometimes speech acts or other forms of communication are also deeds, such that I'm saying something propositionally, but in doing that I'm also performing the action of contesting?
Okay, yeah, the question is about speech acts. I'm going to say that I'm not sure yet, and haven't. So I think that something like I think we're primarily talking about the content of the communication, and then there's a further question as to what sorts of categories you could classify it into. And so if that answers your question, then that's what I mean to say. Otherwise, I'm not sure. Okay. So my current view, I'm going to talk about the reasons that I hold views in general. So I aim for parsimony, which is the same thing as simplicity, so I prefer simpler hypotheses. There's a number of reasons for this. I also prefer more elegant hypotheses. Of course, it depends on the circumstance. If there's good reason to believe that the domain is itself complex, then it will be more elegant to have a more complex hypothesis. I also prefer conservatism, so I tend to choose hypotheses that are closer to what I already believed. And then I also use paradigms, which means that I choose hypotheses that render a field such that you can investigate it and such that you can discuss it. I noted in thinking about this that there were lots of possibilities and lots of ideas, and then my mind I crystallized it, or I came to a particular crystallized view, which seemed nicely simple, elegant. It's a bit further away from my views than before, so these got different dimensions here, and this is not maximally conservative, though I'm trying to be conservative. And I also noted that the new view seems to function like a miniature paradigm because it sort of organizes my thought on the topic. So and notably, just to sort of quickly review, the sorts of phenomena that we're trying to explain here are in fact really quite weird. So there's the poetic expression, like a single conversation in a look. And then there's the fact that we actually have people who stare at each other and then one of them cries at the end. Nothing or very little being said during the time. and then they go back and check, and they both agree on what happened during the conversation, which was unspoken. And they both agree that they were trying to debug a particular issue, and that it went through particular stages, and the thing was debugged, it looks like, at the end. So belief reports indicate that the thing has in fact changed. Okay, that's really weird. Like, when you think about how psychology is supposed to work, normally you think that there is a deeply verbal, technical thing that happens, where you have to ask what's good about that and bad about that and so forth, but then also propose new hypotheses or prompt them to think of things, and there's this huge verbal interaction that takes place, sort of like launch codes. And then if you get the person to understand and interpret all the things properly, then you get certain types of changes at the end. Okay, well, having that occur non-verbally is really quite weird. You could think, with any piece of, any purported phenomenon, you could think, all right, well, that's just not happening. What's happening is that people think that that's happening. They're retroactively reinterpreting it, or they just really need the thing to be true, or etc. You could accept the phenomenon and look for, other types of explanations, or rather, you accept the phenomenon, then you're looking for explanations, and then this is the sort of thing that pushes you in the direction of the precise nonverbal communication. In addition to that, you have, so there's the wordless debugging. You have body work and energy work where it looks like it's producing psychological effects, but the people, again, aren't talking. They're not just staring at each other, but you'll have, like, person A has their hand on person B's shoulder, and then will come away thinking that they have a much more detailed impression of that person's intention, and they check verbally, and in fact that happened. That's a little bit weird. For all of the, so there'll be lots of things stated poetically, like, I knew in a moment, just from the look, all that had transpired. I touched the person on the shoulder, and then thereby immediately understood their intention for completing certain types of tasks. I found that to be very helpful in my self-improvement regime. Wait, what? The second one just seems really, really different and really weird. But we are actually having things like that occur. So what's the explanation? My current theory is, yes, there's nonverbal communication. No, it's not all scaffolded on verbal communication. It happens independently. How expressive is it? Great question. With paradigms, you adopt things that are simple, in many cases, even if the evidence is seeming to incline you one way or the other, so as to render the thing nicely investigatable. And so I'm going with the simple, it's as expressive, they express exactly the same things. As far as I can tell, I'm going to go with they can be thoroughly unrelated to one another. This is the one that I'm most sort of concerned about and may be trying to pin down. I currently think that there can be multiple simultaneous nonverbal conversations, and for simplicity, I'm going with they are equally dynamic. So in other words, the model is just that you're having lots of conversations all at the same time, it's just only one of them is the one you're saying. And maybe you're having 3 other conversations, or just one, in which you tell the person how you really feel about them, or give them the launch codes, or explain that the just and the beautiful are in fact united when you truly understand the good. This is a crazy hypothesis, and for such hypotheses, you need to have evidence that is pushing you out to that sort of thing, and I do think that we are encountering evidence like this. Okay. Yeah.
So I'm interested in the idea of languages, where it's clear that there are not that expressive languages that the person can try to use even verbally, and literal sign language is interesting as a case, and then
I'm going to class sign language as verbal, but yeah.
And then I find the rationalists interesting because I think there's a certain way in which they have tried to ban a certain set of channels and only use others. So I don't know. I guess it could just be that what's going on is in the ecosystem right now is innovation in language.
So I'm going to talk about what is happening here. I'm also going to talk about what's happening with the rationalists. I want to say a bit more about how I think the nonverbal conversation, or sort of how the nonverbal communication works. So and there is a question as to what's causing the changes in the group. I noted this in my post, but I don't think that what happened was that people weren't communicating nonverbally, and suddenly they came to. Instead, I think a different thing is happening, which I will talk about. So as far as how this works, I think that a bunch of regular conversational dynamics apply. I think that in a regular conversation, content is transmitted. Pace varies. You can have a slow conversation or a fast one. It's possible to block people's communication. Somebody says something, you're like, okay, and you get the person to stop transmitting, or you block out at least your own receipt of the information. There's also another thing, which is the degree to which people are defended against receiving different types of content. So one thing that's been noted with the body work and energy work, and then I say by extension the nonverbal communication, is that people are noting that frequently people are undefended along certain different axes. There, I actually think what's happening is actually the same thing that happens with verbal communication. There are ways in which people are frequently undefended verbally. You can imagine, so many or all of us will have had something that someone said to us years ago that stuck in our head that was like particularly insulting or upsetting or something, so someone might, say, that was in such bad taste. And you overheard it, and then you're like, and then the thing sticks in your head, and then like sort of is there and always an object you're interacting with, but it happened verbally. Okay, well I think you can encounter the same sorts of things in nonverbal communication. And then it's an interesting question, how defended, how fortified are people non-verbally as opposed to verbally? I'm inclined to think that there are many more vulnerabilities in terms of nonverbal communication. It may not be that, though. It may be that just there's a greater degree of policing of verbal communication. It could be that it would be super easy to mess other people up by just thinking about some horrible thing that you could say to them. Or thinking about like really, strange sort of like threats that you could make, or like there could be all sorts of things you'd say that would really throw someone off. And happily, you can go around and tell other people that so-and-so said this terrible thing, and people then try to avoid saying these things verbally. So it may be that people are actually themselves not particularly fortified against verbal communication, but rather we have social norms that prevent and sort of punishment mechanisms that prevent people from communicating certain things verbally. So it could be that just the nonverbal communication, it could be that people are rather undefended across the board, and instead the difference is just it's harder to police the nonverbal level. It's like, well, that person nonverbally communicated something to me that just made me feel terrible about myself. And people are like, it's like pretty weird to feel like, who's at fault? Did it happen? Way harder to decide. So I think the fact of there being points of undefendedness is the same across verbal and nonverbal, but I do think there are a bunch of differences with nonverbal communication, or sort of differences between them. So one is that I currently think that, so verbal usually in functional conversations is sequential. So I say something, then Nahal says something, then I say something, then Nahal says something. I think the nonverbal stuff is happening at the same time. It might be that that's not true, but I currently think that it is. Also, I think that it's automatic, so you can simply stop talking. You can't simply stop communicating nonverbally. If you could imagine what it would look like if a person communicated nothing nonverbally and they walked through the room, like this might be utterly shocking. Might be among the more surreal. You might even not be able to remember it. It might be that it's so discontinuous with other things that you experience. And so the, yeah, right. So this is that a bunch of people adopt sub-goal, be able to communicate absolutely nothing so as to walk through rooms so that others will forget. Invisibility level 1.0.
It's just that you can have different views on how large is the shadow area in the group's collective memory? Where you could have a view where there have been like large events, like parties we all went to that just got delayed.
Everyone forgot this. So I know of at least we had one group-wide meeting, I think in July of 2014, that essentially everyone forgot despite transcript and beaming other people. It was just so that this sort of thing I think can happen. And then it would be really interesting if you look back through the log and you're like, well, I don't remember any of this stuff. Okay, so I think you've got it's simultaneous, automatic. One thing that's really critical is that people can pay attention to what they're saying verbally. If you're like, you know, hey, back off, man, and they're like, you just said, hey, back off, man, and they're like, no, I didn't. It's like, no, people have enough access to be able to tell mostly the things that they're saying right then. With the nonverbal stuff, there appears to be limited introspective access. And so some of the things you can tell, some of the things you can come to easily tell, or easily come to tell, and some of the things seem to be blocked in a way that is not easy to overcome. Yes?
On the simultaneity point, were you saying it's simultaneous with verbal communication, or simultaneous that both parties are at the same time non-verbal?
I think simultaneous with verbal and simultaneous between parties. The thing I was pointing to is the simultaneous between parties.
Okay.
So it's like, I'm like, how you doing? And you're like, I'm doing, you know, there's things going on. And so and this is like happening at the same time. Okay. I already noted the fact of them being policed differently, which is a social difference. So then that's sort of some of how I think the thing works. I guess I should add here that I think that conversations frequently stabilize in a group. So our group, we're talking about new things. The things we're talking about now are different than 6 months ago or different than 6 months before that. Most groups aren't like this. They end up stabilizing on at least a wide range of conversations. And so there will be the conversation again about how your group is better than the other group in a bunch of the standard ways. Or the conversation again about how you care about the other person and they care about you, and isn't that very wonderful? Sometimes conversation stabilizes in a good point where it's beneficial and both people benefit. Sometimes it stabilizes in a boring point. I noticed that one might, at least some are wincing at the idea of conversation stabilizing. But I think conversation frequently stabilizes. And I think that with nonverbal communication, conversation also frequently stabilizes. So that what you end up with is, with a given group, there's a particular conversation that comes to be the nonverbal conversation that's being had. There's questions as to how much this is disrupted. Perhaps a piece of news that affects the group then changes the group conversation. The entrance of a new person or someone leaves changes the group conversation. But I think that in a lot of cases, you do end up with the thing being stabilized. I think the thing that's happening to us recently is people are gaining read and write access, and that this is leading us to be able to change the group nonverbal conversation, or the individual nonverbal conversations, and also the group nonverbal conversation quite dramatically. So in terms of I'll say a little bit about this. So I said read access and write access. If this in fact is really happening, then wouldn't it be nice to know what you're communicating and what others are communicating to others? Good news, you already do know, just not with a part of your mind that you have introspective access to. So it's good news and bad news. Further news is that it's possible to gain greater introspective access. This is something that we're working on from a number of different angles. This does just then translate to the problem of helping people gain the ability to access things in their mind. And then it's because people are syncing up through the nonverbal communication, you frequently, by gaining better access to yourself, gain the ability to tell more of what the other person is transmitting. Yeah.
It seems like there's another problem in this space, which is that people are often unreflectively owned by nonverbal stuff. So like often people can't tell they're syncing with the narrative. That seems to be another one of the problems in this class with detecting what's going on.
Yeah, no, that's true. And so in terms of when I say there's people lacked introspective access, I don't actually think that that's random, or that there's an independent dial, which is how much introspective access do you have. There's a question as to what's causing the lack of introspective access, but very, very frequently it's syncing with some particular viewpoint and refusing to consider anything that is alternate to that. In some cases, it's always directing your attention away from something. And so there'll be a bunch of different phenomena that lead to people not having the ability to explicitly articulate the things that they do in fact understand on a nonverbal level. There's also right access. This is the ability to, through explicit and introspectively identifiable action, change the thing that you're communicating on in the nonverbal manner. This is something that seems to be heavily related to one's own beliefs and one's own intentions as you figure out how to modify your intention and render yourself so as you figure out how to modify your intention, this frequently allows you to communicate different things. Well, so then there's like a lot of questions, like, well, okay, how do I communicate this specifically, and how do I figure out the bad things that I'm communicating, and how do I switch this, et cetera, et cetera. Answer: not really sure. We're working on this. The sort of gaining better introspective access is the sort of, like I said, an area that we're looking at. As far as right access, one thing that I would say is that in many cases, you don't want to switch yourself to be always communicating X. Usually the thing that looks like it works is you want to get the right intention and render yourself responsive. If you're adequately responsive and have the right intention, then you will communicate the relevant things. Of course, then there's this question: how can you tell how good your intention is? And do you have the right intention? We don't have general diagnostics right now. There are a whole bunch of further questions about how to interact with the phenomenon overall, and I think the general answer is that we don't currently know. There's the, is this hypothesis correct, or if not, then is a variant that's close enough correct such that you'd be worried about this? If you are, then it's like, okay, well, what to do with it? They're, not perfectly sure. In fact, deeply currently unsure. Oh yeah, I was going to talk about this. This is the part about the conversations usually being repetitive and usually being stabilized. Notably, I think the thing that's happening in the group is not, sorry, I mentioned this, it's not, the conversations aren't happening and they switch to happening. It's rather that the people gain more ability to articulate the nonverbal things, and then all of the plans that you have that interface with the things that are rendered explicit can go to work. So it's like if the person has a bunch of plans that they do have introspective access to, are rendered explicit, and then you find some implicit content and render it explicit, this might change what you're doing, because you now have, like, so suppose you have, write a blog post about everything important that you believe, and then you render something explicit. Okay, well, now you're going to write a blog post about it, whereas you weren't going to before. So by gaining access to the things and rendering them explicit, then your current plans will interface with them differently. That's one change. You also then get changes as you modify your intention and modify what you are broadcasting non-verbally, then people are going to react different ways, you're going to react different ways. This yields a bunch of very weird dynamics. It could be, like, so the, and I'll sort of talk about this more in terms of how this messes with our systems, but it could very well be that the way that secrets work in general is not that they don't know. They do know, and they're, politely or however wise, not introspectively accessing the things. And so it could be that there's like a difference between something that is in fact not known and something that is known in the parts of the mind that the person doesn't have access to, and then the people's plans for actions involve not acting on those things. It becomes very weird thinking about information security in this context. Like, is it better for people to truly not know a thing, or do you want everyone to know, but in such a way that they only know it non-verbally and have stable plans to not act on that? I don't know. This is very strange. Yeah.
There seems to be another thing in this class that I haven't heard mentioned, which is that alongside the nonverbal conversation, there often seems to be transferred just like a general imprint of the person you're interacting with that can then be introspected on and interacted with.
Yeah, so I guess there's another question which I should have added, which is what's the volume of total nonverbal? And so you could imagine that it's very expressive and can cover all sorts of things, and you're having 7 conversations simultaneously, but the total amount of information communicated is very small. So I guess a further distinction is the amount of information like small, large, etc. In fact, this is something I should actually talk about right now, so a nice segue. So if there is this more robust form of communication, then there's a question as to how far does it spread. If you're telling people the launch codes, do they tell further people? Do they tell everyone? Does, how long does this take? There should be, with any sort of spread of information, you should be able to ask sort of how far does it spread? Options here, and so this is in the open questions area. I'm really quite unsure, and then it would be wonderful to figure out how we could confirm or deny a bunch of these things. It's also possible we end up with evidence that refutes the initial hypothesis. That would be cool. Then things are very confusing because we still have to explain the weird sort of anomalous things we've come across. But so it could be that communication only spreads nearby, only to people you know well and interact with for a substantial amount of time. And so in this, maybe I interact with Stephanos for a while and I get a pretty thorough imprint of Stephanos' mind, such that if I introspect enough, then I'll be able to piece through and find out tons and tons and tons of information about him. But Stephanos' friend, who I've never met, I can't do the same thing with. Now you could think that it could be, though, that the friend has interacted a lot with Stephanos, and so Stephanos has the imprint. And so then if he interacts with me, maybe I receive the imprint. So maybe the thing extends out 2 clicks. Or maybe it extends out more than that. You could imagine like a near range one where it's just people who you're currently interacting with. You could imagine a mid one where everything spreads 2 clicks away on the social graph. You could imagine that there's actually much, much more widespread communication, such that it goes everywhere.
Yeah, you have modeled everyone.
Yeah, you actually know, and it's like, why aren't you looking at that? Well, you haven't introspected in the right way, and there's all sorts of blocks, and you think it's impolite, and you think it'd be insane to think that you would have access to that. Why do you think it's insane? Well, that's what people say, and you've got a sort of societal defense mechanism against people looking into the things. You don't want to be insane and opine about a bunch of things that you don't really know, and so you turn your attention away from this massive imprint which you actually have. And the thing is, we have sort of, there's also the phenomenon of the social layer, where it seems like people seem to sync up on what's in the social layer quite quickly, a quite sort of broad way. How is that happening? Is that there's just key nodes like newspapers and everybody's 2 clicks away from somebody who reads the relevant newspaper or news site? Or is it that there's central distribution that happens and then it just spreads, so there's the how far does it spread? There's also how fast does it spread? Where it could be that it actually takes a long time for the information. That's why you need to interact with the person for a while. It could be that it's pretty quick. Stephanos walks through the room. In that time has communicated to me all the relevant updates. But I don't communicate them further until I walk through the room with somebody else there. And then, of course, there's the possibility that the thing is in fact transmitted instantaneously, so that instead what you have is sort of everybody updating simultaneously. There's a question as to how well is the information preserved. So you might imagine that the information is really specific nearby, but as you go more and more clicks out on the social graph, the information becomes more and more general, or it just becomes more and more lossy, so that you're like, oh wait, no, I can find in Astephanos the imprint of his mother and her friend from the childhood who knew this other guy. I'm getting that he had a beard. And nope, he doesn't have a beard. Didn't have a beard at any point. What happened is you tried to work your way through the information. The information is there. It's just that the thing is sufficiently error-prone that as soon as you go far away enough, then the thing is wrong, or is frequently wrong.
And it might not be that it's just wrong. It's just the thing that's like increasingly fuzzy until the information is just...
Yeah, that's right. So it could be that it becomes non-specific. It could be you could say, well, it's only fuzzy, but that's because my intention to look at it isn't good enough yet. And you could imagine that it's preserved only poorly, or it's preserved with lots of errors. You could imagine that it's preserved well with lots of specifics, and then there's the extreme version, which is that we all know what's going on, because we have all the information, and acting on, and then society over the course of time has figured out how to have people partition their minds in such a way that they only look at a tiny, locally relevant part of that information. There's also the question of the transmission mechanism. My current theory is that this is nonverbal communication in the sense of body language, the thing that you could also transmit a lot by the design of a room. Nevertheless, it's all physical. If it turns out that the thing is instantaneous and universal, then, well, how instantaneous? Faster than the speed of light? It seems like then we're already well outside of current physical paradigms. This might make you postulate that there is such a thing as mind-mind communication. And this stuff is frequently eerie, where you're like, is it a coincidence, or did we just had a weird case of simultaneous transmission where people somehow already knew the relevant things? The reason that I'm currently defaulting to it being body language and nonverbal elements of texts, and then sort of aspects of the environment and so forth, is that that's much, much more continuous with the previous things that I know how to think about. So this is an element of conservatism. It's also the case that it's just much harder to work inside of a paradigm where you have to postulate, some sorts of things. The easiest alternate thing to do would be to postulate that it was universal and instantaneous, if you have it be mind-mind. If not, then you start getting all these weird questions about mind-ons. What are mind-ons? Well, you've got gravitons and photons, which are the, and so there's a question of, does it go at 38 meters per second and is insulated with lead? If you sort of have enough lead shielding between you and others, then you don't get mind-mind transfer. Yep, that's right. Then one should adopt an aluminum or a tinfoil hat at that time. That will help prevent the transmissions, or does it merely amplify them? I think what you end up with is a whole bunch of unknowns in your theory, and that's just like much harder to work with as a paradigm. So I'm starting with it's physical, it's communicated by means of body. I'm inclined to think that it's not very slow and it's not only very local, but I'm not yet ready to say that I think that it is near instantaneous or that it's society-wide. Yeah.
It seems at the very least, if we're not positing mind-ons, in a bunch of the cases, we're forced to add the additional posit, which is that humans are like much, much more sensitive to nonverbal communication than normally thought.
Yes.
Where if it is in fact the case, for instance, that I can be like across a room with my eyes closed, and Emily can be across the room with her eyes closed and her like hand in the air, and like getting full propositions from me, then like something dramatically weirder than we think is going on with the transmission.
That's right. So you have to look at sensitivity, and so the thing you're referring to, I think you're referring to an actual case that happened. Yeah, that's right. So multiple times, right? So you get Tyler and Emily's eyes are both closed,
and with prompting, I can then refer with verbal detail to the specific position in Tyler's body.
And I can
my
find
hand position is corresponding to, and then Tyler can find it, and then and then I can tell when he's found it.
Yeah, like,
so this may not be
here, and Emily's be like, feel like
so it may not be able to be picked up by the microphone, but the thing that was yet another instance of one of these incredibly weird things where, but you're in the same room, and you also will have something. So there's a question as to how precise is hearing. How you get really weird things where maybe as babies the thing's fully on, and then we just forget over the course of time as we learn to shut ourselves down. In which case, do you put a baby into the room and have them receive all the secret information and then take them out? So you're like, oh, that's interesting. That's right. Yeah, that's right. You've got, sort of espionage. There's just sort of like, welcome to the conference. Here's your private conference room. There's a baby here as part of, setting the scene. Let's all remember the future of the world. Yeah.
So along these lines, one thing that's still a little confusing to me is that phenomenologically, when doing interaction on this layer, it feels a lot like
pregnant women. Sorry.
Couple.
So you have an attachment, right? So the baby can receive all the intentions, and then you're like deeply wired up to this thing. Pregnant woman has like a microphone.
She's not wearing a wire. She's just pregnant.
That's right. I don't see any problem here.
So people frequently use hands as amplifiers, and then as the thing gets more powerful, they don't feel the need to do that. And then experientially what happens is it feels like the closer you are to the person, the higher the signal is. As though, in phenomenology, humans are wireless and just transmitting shit, and like the visual stuff is completely irrelevant. There's a possibility of there being like a vibratory mechanism on which we're all communicating.
Sure, yeah. So and then you're thinking of like, there's mind-ons, and then they have like some sort of physical range and so forth. Maybe not. Maybe it's done through a physical thing, and then there's an advanced physical theory. Yeah, I mean, so I'm not really sure. I think this is an open question. I think there are really, really important sub-questions so I currently have an answer to this where my answer currently is yes. But one really, really important question is whether names can be transmitted. There's a recent instance of a friend of mine who I was describing some of the interesting things we've been encountering, and she says, oh, that's strange. Just recently I had this experience where I hugged my friend and immediately just had this very, very strong impression they were going to give me very bad news. And I said, you're going to tell me bad news. The friend's like, what? No, I'm not. And the friend says that they had a very strong impression that it was of a particular person. And so they said, no, it is going to be, there's bad news and it's about this person. And their friend's like, oh, yeah, no, I was going to tell you. Here's some very bad news about this particular friend. So on the face of it, looks like a case where the person reads a name off of someone. If you read a name, then that's like very specific and like very, very strange. And then I suspect that...
notably that particular example, they both knew the person.
That's right. So they both knew the person.
So there could be inference, not reading.
Yeah, so that's right. So that's right. So
they're upset. What could they be upset about? It's not their job. I know that they're good with this person.
This is a very good point. So one of the things that I think we're going to eventually pin down is there's a question as to how much is communicated and how much is inferred, where if you have 3 different books and I'm like, the second, I only communicated like the number 2 to you, but yet now you know this huge list of sentences that I've selected. So it's sort of, with any amount of successful communication, there's how much transmitted and how much interpreted. It could be that things are very, very heavily relying on interpretation so that the transmission itself is relatively sparse. One thing I should note is that I think that we're going to end up with lots of fantastical tales told as we interact with this. I think that the correct thing to do is to categorize them as, fantastical tales or marvelous things. Aristotle has this book on marvelous things heard, where it actually makes sense to keep track of the various things that you've heard to see whether, all sorts of things can happen. People can embellish. There can be, misunderstanding, misinterpretation, miscommunication along the way, sort of, whispering down the lane where the message gets changed a bunch. But sometimes the marvelous things heard are in fact things that happened. And so, like ball lightning is a really great example here. For people who don't know the history of ball lightning, what ball lightning is just like balls of lightning that move around. They can be different sizes and colors. Scientists thought that this was a prejudice of the townsfolk, that a superstition. They maintained that balls of lightning would occur and like chase people and so forth. Eventually there was a I believe the story is there's an airplane that got struck by lightning, and then a ball of lightning went down the corridor, and the plane happened to have a bunch of scientists in it. And like, all right, it's real. So the scientists are themselves the townsfolk, then the thing gets promoted officially. But it may be that many of the marvelous things heard are in fact true. And I think there's going to be a lot of like attempts to figure out which things are coincidental and which things aren't. And I think this will be actually rather difficult to do. Like an interesting story that I definitely haven't gotten to the bottom of has to do with my brother. My brother called me up for my birthday. I hadn't talked to him. And he's like, Jeff, all this crazy stuff's going on with me. I, lost 90 pounds, no longer am experiencing all the pain I was experiencing. I've like changed a bunch of things I'm doing. Notably, I picked up Aikido, and I've been focusing on Qi and Qi power. And there's a lot you can get into here, and like starts talking about all this. And I'm like, that's interesting. We've started looking at some similar things. I imagine that this is purely coincidental. Well, okay, is it purely coincidental? On some of the more extreme communication scenarios, it could be that my brother's choices are in some way related to mine. That would not be shocking at all. And then stuff we're working on here gets transmitted out to local communities and passed on to further people. And eventually my brother receives the message that, hey, Jeff's working on blah, blah, and blah. And then he's like, oh, that sounds neat. I'll look into that also. And it affects his intention in the relevant way. And then there's a change. It could be that he thought that it wouldn't be a good idea to look into because, I wouldn't think that it was a good idea to look into. But then when I switch, he has all this natural, impetus to go look into the thing. On the other hand, maybe it's just a normal coincidence. Or maybe there's something that's like much easier, like I talked to my mom and then she talked to him. I'm not really sure. I think we're going to end up encountering a lot of sort of weird things like this. So we should keep track of them and remember the idea of categorizing things as marvelous things heard. Yes?
So on that note, then there's also this question of how much the project and the research we've done has already affected the world.
I know. There's a question of how much our stuff is affecting the world. Like, it could be that our intention, there's the easy version is just Samo and I talk to Teal, give him various ideas, and he talks it non-verbally to lots of different people, and so there's like a central distribution point. You could have more extreme things, like that the fact that we still have a victory intention, despite the fact of massive communication with everywhere in the world, means that things are that's a really promising sign. It could be that all the intentions have interacted and it comes out with us still having a victory intention. That'd be cool, I think. But we really don't understand this.
It's like all the fights are already priced in. Because
that's right. The fights could already be priced in. That's right. It could be that it doesn't spread that much, but that our intention definitely, you could imagine it interacting with the rationalists and EAs. And the reason why they say such strange things about us is because verbally we're a social science research institute, or here's 500 other explanations. And non-verbally we're saying, and then they're like, okay, I can see, but I'll do that too. And then when they go to talk, they find that it's just too jarring to say the things that are actually like the facts that they see. Or it could be any number of other things that are going on. Our workshops have changed notably, such that the vibe used to be much more of a like, here's our thing, do you like it? Maybe you won't, but you should, because here's our thing, and there's arguments for it, to more like a, we're doing a thing, it's, if you want to hear about it, we'll tell you, okay, you've got various objections, and now we're still doing our thing, which is just very, very different.
There's also there's a lot of stuff going on, but we're going to show you this part of it. Don't really worry about the rest.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, no. So I think this is all, it's very peculiar. So in terms of how this affects us, I'll just briefly note that I think this undermines most of our systems. It's distressing. I say it in a light, amusing manner, but in fact, it's like information management is among the easier ones to see that this undermines, but also like there's the privacy stuff and share permissions. And is it okay for someone to tell you they heard X from a person, and they want to tell you not it because they don't have share permissions on it, but they do have a vibe read which they had independently, which does sort of logically entail the thing. and then there's just like tons of other even more borderline cases. Yes, Anna.
I found people are extremely obedient to an even slight vibe that this is something you should not know.
Yes.
I think that that's right. I think that, so Sam was noting that people are very obedient, even a slight vibe, that this is something you shouldn't do. And then we might imagine...
Shouldn't know, to be precise.
Oh, that you shouldn't.
The implication was it's possible to do infosec if you just intend the person to not know.
And that would be a notable change to our information security policies. It could be that the answer is just intend that they don't understand it. Which is weird because we probably want something a bit more nuanced, because I think we do want people to understand a bunch of what we're doing. But so anyway, this is weird. It affects obviously interaction dynamics, who's responsible for what, conflict resolution, understanding the group and what it's doing, its trajectory, the social layer, construction of there's just, this affects everything. That's probably great, all things considered, but right now it's very jumbly.
Yeah, we probably aren't ready at this point in the investigation as a group, but I am looking forward to the time when arguments can be made about the limits of the thing.
Oh, yeah.
No,
I agree.
Much discussion of that.
No,
and you were like, guess what? I debugged my dead grandmother.
That's right. No, I agree. So, as you open up a new area, you're like, there's all sorts. It's like self-improvement. There's all sorts of things that you could do, and then you figure out here's how the thing works with nonverbal communication or whatever's happening.
It's like a path object, right? So there's like a reason to make it like powerful and good, and likewise with debugging, right? So like debugging, you can believe that debugging solves everything or whatever, and there's disagreement in the group about like how far it takes you, and this happens. Path objects.
Yeah, so I agree with that. I think. Yep, Tyler.
To backtrack a little bit, one thing that affects a lot of the spreading factors is an additional factor of the learning curve on someone's nonverbal communication. Mm-hmm. So you might imagine that each new person speaks like their own Creole. Yep. That takes some time to adjust to until you can get the content. Yep. Or you might imagine basically it's fairly, on average, like normalized such that you can pick it up right away. Mm-hmm. Just call that out as something to investigate.
Wait, so what's the thing? Can you say it again?
Well, you can imagine that, for instance, when I meet you for the first time, Jeff, that I can't understand any of your nonverbal communication. And so we've talked for like 5 minutes or an hour or a week or 0 time.
Yeah, no, that's right. I think, so there will be differences in sort of more generally just understanding, but more generally than understanding how quickly we can acclimate to people who are communicating in different ways or communicating just different things non-verbally. Yeah.
Another way this could affect us is it could be that all the trainees already have all the trainers' imprints and all the relevant things that they could want to learn and are just playing hard to get with all the things.
All right, this is true. So one thing that's very notable is that a number of people have started experimenting with intention transfer as a method of training, where you look at the imprint you already have of the relevant person, or you get them to give you the relevant thing by means of touch, or you can do it without touch. And notably, it looks like, I think Jason's researching this, and that it looks like there are some traditions that actually have this as their Tibetan type traditions that actually have this as their standard way of training. You could imagine a future version of us where the way that training works is you come in and the trainer puts their hand on your shoulder and you're like, got it. And then you go away and process, and then you repeat this many times.
Yeah. Or you transfer many of the psych solutions, the person just sits there like, sweet.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's right. Okay. Daniel.
Something that I'm noticing feels puzzling is, it seems, sorry. I'm curious whether you think it's the case that things of the level of detail and sort of randomness, like launch codes, are communicated. And
I'm still working on that. I think that there's something it is the receiving surface is, I think that the communication also is synced up, and what's happening is in order to communicate a thing, the receiver has to be in a position to be able to receive it. And so I think that it's not the case. I think that you need to have a detailed interaction of intentions for there to be a bunch of detailed complex information passed along. Maybe. I don't know. It's just like, it seems like on one hand, the thing that I just said, where you need the body worker has to like sit there and go like this for a while to get into the right spot. On the other hand, people seem to get each other's imprints really fast. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm not exactly sure. Yeah, not sure. Last thing I want to do, I'm probably going to go till 1:35, is talk about my current theory about what's happening, like as a sort of environmental or like what, embed this in some context. The things I want to note are, so the first thing is chakras, fast theory of chakras. We didn't used to talk about them, then we started. I think Dima's theory of what they are is basically right. I think there are balance points in the body, and that it's possible to, that's the key thing from Dima, taking that. I think you can attach psychological content to your body map. This occurs by adding muscle tension. You can chase muscle tension upstream, like relax your hand by tensing your wrist, relax your wrist by tensing higher in your forearm. This means that it's possible to chase tension upstream. The best places to put tension are physically are going to be the ones that impede movement the less, and the balance points are the ones that you actually move the least, which means that there is a natural place to move muscle tension, which is to the balance points, and this means that you should end up, getting high concentrations of psychological information at the balance points. It is also the case that a bunch of people having looked at this, we've got a number of different theories of exactly what the content is, but it looks like standardly people have 7 of these. Don't get too fixated on that because you can have the content misplaced because of how you decided to balance your body. It could be that there are more, but at least it appears that, so our practitioners are frequently finding that there are 7 and that they do in fact correspond to the chakras as traditionally described. So search on Google Images, get the chakras, you're like, okay, here, you've got the root and the belly and the solar plexus. So it's like, root is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. It's been sufficiently useful that a bunch of us just refer to them by numbers. So like, well, I found this in 3, I found this in 5. There's also content that's usually associated with them. So this has to do with grounding or groundedness or connection to reality. Different people will give you different versions of this. This has to do with desire or wanting. This has to do with individual action. This is just the version that I use right now. 4 has to do with community or connection and love. 5 has to do with, I think, individuation in a way that allows you to come to have a coherent view of the world. So I think of this as something like a single coherent view, maybe individuation is a better thing to say. Then 6 is where you get the capacity for multiple stories. So you get alternate stories here. And 7 is intelligible order, which organizes everything else. The talk to different practitioners to get their specific reads on it, but it's something like this, I think. And then, in addition to psychological content, and so then what you'll find is you're like, okay, put my mind into the relevant spot. Oh, I'm finding content that pertains to groundedness, or oh, I'm finding content that pertains to connection to other people. It just seems like a sufficiently common thing that a whole bunch of trainers have started and are continuing to use the chakra models and can communicate with each other. It's fact number 1. Fact number 2, partitions. We don't exactly understand how they work, but it looks like people end up with divisions beneath which people cannot introspect. People still receive information. You still have plans. People can still act from them, but you can't introspect on them. Breaking down partitions is one of the main things we're trying to do. I currently think that, and this is a new model as of this morning, well, I had some other parts of it, and Emily and I talked about it a bit and sort of expanded it. But I currently think that different civilizations put the partitions in different places, and that as a result, you get different sort of results in sort of standard mind types. I currently think that Christianity puts the partition there, such that people are worse on groundedness and worse on one's own desire. Sexuality is related, but that then in general you end up with the attempt to unify these guys. I think that there's a question as to what's happening in classical or sort of ancient Greek and ancient Roman societies. I currently think that you actually have 2 through 7 with all of them being unified, that people won't differentiate themselves from nature. And then the thing that first causes people to differentiate from nature is the addition of a partition. After that, then there's something that leads to the cutting off of individual desire. And then I'm not exactly sure on so I think that the adding of the partition requires the person to redirect their attention. And so as you block off more content, you end up with more attentional redirects, which also gives you more ability to use the synthetic faculties of the mind. And so then what ends up happening is that more and more of the person's self is cut off. This leads to an increasing degree of despair, because the parts that are cut off is a source of despair, because the person needs all the things to be unified. But they also gain a greater ability to use the synthetic, sort of basically using IPs. I think that the synthetic use of the mind enables greater reasonability by putting together elegant structures, and greater goodness by separating out and combining elements of goodness synthetically. So there's sort of a trade-off. And if you look, for example, at Christianity, my current, and so more to be said, so I'm just going to make some remarks now because we're right near the end. My current view of sin is that, so not just individual sins, there's this question, what does this concept mean in human sinfulness? I currently think that with regard to human sinfulness, it is the propensity to have despair corrupt the understanding. And so you can have it be like, sins aren't just like, oops, you made a mistake, but it's also not the same as direct opposition to the good. There's something like the people are trying to be good, but despite that they can't. I think that that's summed up by the idea that you have despair, and that despair is then infecting the rest of the person's understanding of the world. Well, notably, if you cut off parts of yourself, then I think that that will lead to despair, and that will infect the rest of the things. And so it could be that what Christianity is aiming to do is to unify these guys and then give you ways to overcome the despair that come about as a result of having cut off 1 and 2. Why would one do this? Why would you transition? Well, it could just be that humans become more coordinatable as you cut off certain aspects. And so it could be that you just get a different coordination structure, better ability to use synthetics, better ability to import reason and goodness. And then I've been discussing with people whether it looks like modern society cuts people off at below 5. When we're looking at people, we're finding lots of partitions occurring below 5, so that people have the sort of parts they introspect on are usually 5, 6, and 7, with it being much spottier below here. And again, it's not all as simple as just these patches are completely blocked off. People have access to different parts of them. But so it could be that what's happening is that modern civilization is cutting off more of people in a way that gives you greater access or greater ability to use the synthetic parts of the mind, but that then also cut you off from individual action and cut you off from community and love. What sorts of things happen? So if you think about what an atomized society is and what sorts of people live in it, you might think about automatons. Okay, well, how do you have it be that humans end up being automatons? Well, maybe you cut off their grounding to reality, their desire, their ability to act in community, while leaving them with a single code, leading them with ideology, as well as the ability to think and to order things. Also, it might just be that it's too much of a civilizational shift to cause people to cut off more than one chakra at once, because it's just like a very large amount of content. So it might be that there's an intermediate state, and it could be that in general there are greater forms of coordination that occur as a result of partitioning the mind more and more. If that ends up being true, that gives us some clue as to what we need to do to have it be that we end up with humans actually in a good state. And I will note that then in some sort of as a summary, I think that at least atomization is causing people to block off access, which makes it so that you get a lot of the sort of effects of the type that we're seeing. And then I think that this was less true in previous societies, but still true to a degree. And then there's this interesting question as to whether there's a progression.
Can you say more about what's happening below the partition? So like, are those pieces then cut off from one another, or are there like two teams?
Well,
and you just don't know
well,
the other teams
this is a great question. I think what happens is that usually when you don't have introspective access, the things end up less developed and less connected to each other. But you will have people who manage to connect them more and develop them more, and then those will be people who find that they're taking actions that aren't the sort that they understand explicitly. And there can be good things and bad things about both, but I think you'll end up with generally less coherent action and sort of like fewer considerations taken into account.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I'll note also that the separation at 5 corresponds to what we've been calling the social layer and body layer, and those may not be natural kinds and instead a consequence of our.
Well, that's what I'm thinking. Something like the sort of the verbal layer may just be the part that's above the partition, and then there's the part below the partition, and it could be that the partition has been shifting over the course of time. Yeah.
Another useful thing to note about this is that the amount of development that happens to the chakras that get partitioned off substantially determines the later shape of the person's mind and how it's considered.
Yeah, that's right. So, and then what ends up happening is that if people end up with semi-developed or sort of much more connected versions of these, that affects sort of the overall shape of the person. And so then you could imagine that the thing to do is to use the fact of the increased intentional redirects to master the synthetic use of the mind so as to be able to recover the lost elements. That is, of course, my preferred approach. But yeah, so it's all very weird. Yeah.
So we also talk about there being like many partitions.
That's right. So it's an interesting question whether it looks like this or whether it looks like this. And then there's an interesting question as to whether it's as simple as a line. I mean, these are just numbers. In fact, there's tons of content. You could imagine a map where there's like lots of walls here and like little passageways around here. And so that, and one thing that seems to be the case is that you end up with much greater development of skill in people who are able to take the underlying content and make it up through. So you could have some, like, how solid is the partition, how porous is the thing. I think we don't yet know. This is like a very simplified map of the thing. But I think it's going to end up being much more like sort of like an actual map with walls and roots channeling. They're sort of routing things around. Yeah.
One thing Emily's at least found in me is multiple body maps. So you might even imagine different body maps suited like in different modes or suited for different contexts in which you have different partition structures.
Yeah, that sounds quite plausible to me. Yeah, you can end up with multiple body maps with different partition structures. I think that those are actually going to be themselves based on there being a more like a fundamental partition structure.
There's still a question of how the partition gets made and transferred in the individuals.
Oh yeah, and so there's an interesting question. It could be that there was one individual who had a sufficiently strong intention to separate the mind in a particular way, and that everyone synced with them, and that person then determined a new coordination mechanism, and the rest of society then sort of eventually got I mean, it could have been Descartes, for example. Jesus was earlier. There's a question of is it Jesus or Paul? But yeah, it could have been that you end up with people with sufficiently strong intentions that it leads to the repartitioning of the mind and the changing of the revealed form of human nature.
New path. Just kidding, guys.
Suggest both fascism and communism is the intermediate stage.
So there's a proposal for fascism and communism. I actually think fascism and communism are, I think, both occurring with this. There's a question as to whether we're in the middle of a further transition, where Emily suggested that maybe the sort of more people on the Asperger's spectrum are actually getting the partition put between 5 and 6. I think that the ideologically related things make use of the underlying stuff, but then has 5 guiding. I'm not sure, though. This is all very hard to say. Sama?
I strongly recommend people actually watch the movies, either communist or fascist movies, and read some books written by actual communists or fascists, or people who have actually lived in such societies. Like overall, sociological speculation can be a fun backdrop, but it just can be more than that.
I agree. Yep. Ben.
So I think it is highly plausible that the civilizations have different patterns of where the common partitions are, but I want to push back against the sort of unstated but clearly displayed idea of a unitary progression of the partition moving higher and higher over time. I think it is substantially more likely that it moves in both directions over the course of centuries.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So I'm not yet sure. There's a question of like individual societies versus the entire world. I put a model about revolutions. So I have a model where it's like you get more things under the partition, but then that gives more sort of material for a revolution. So I wouldn't be surprised if you ended up with cycles. Not really sure. This is all me coming up with stuff, and also I as yet lack a lot of sociological and historical knowledge. Okay, end.